Today, we will be enjoying an insightful presentation from St. Louis University's Dr. Jonathan Sawday. Dr. Sawday received the James Russell Lowell Prize for the most outstanding book published in 2023. In the UK, Dr. Sawday has been a regular broadcaster on BBC Radio, presenting features and contributing to discussions on a wide variety of topics, including Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, technology and culture, the human genome, the history of syphilis, which I wouldn't mind hearing that one, the passing of Concorde, fear in the modern world, spontaneously with Malcolm Gladwell, plus many other cultural topics. His 5-part radio series, The King Returned, was first broadcast on BBC Freethinking Festival. His United Kingdom TV work includes writing, presenting, and contributing to programs on Renaissance anatomy, the photography of Lennart Neilson, student finance, contemporary body art. His presentation this morning is titled, What Makes Us Human? So, you're on.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thank you very much. There is a handout. Here you go. And because, can you hear me on that? Yeah. And because I'm a college teacher, there will be a quiz. So my title, What Makes Us Human, conceals within itself a problem, because I'm using the verb makes. And that might suggest that we aren't necessarily human, that we become human, or that we're made human, or that we're fabricated in some way. And that may be something that we'll come back to. This talk is going to be... there we go. This talk, it's going to be really about technology, our kind of interactions with technology. And it springs out of a book that I published, a long time ago. I think it was 2009. This book, this is not a book plugging session. I don't expect you to go rushing off to the shops to buy a copy. In any case, you probably won't find one. But the book was about the impact of technology on the human imagination in a time which we tend not to think of as being technologically driven. It was subtitled Renaissance Culture and the Rise of the Machine. Renaissance culture, the European Renaissance in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so some of the ideas I'm going to sort of put out to you this morning, and I should have said, first of all, I forgot, thank you very much for inviting me, and to Jill for inviting me. But some of the ideas I'm going to put out to you this morning come out of this book. The ways in which people in the past understood their technology in a pre-industrial age are rather different from the ways in which perhaps we now tend to think of technology. Chiefly, perhaps, they saw, or they tended to see technology as what they felt as a restoration, a means of reversing a disaster. And that disaster was, in Christian mythology, the disaster of the fall. I'm sure you're all familiar, the story of Adam and Eve and the garden and so on. But could also be understood mythologically through other cultures. The idea of a lost golden age, a lost past in which things were somehow better. And technology, and what exactly I mean by that, I hope will become clear, but technology was seen as a means of kind of not reversing that catastrophe, as they tended to think of it, but as a means of alleviating it in some way. So some of the ideas that this book goes through, which will crop up in what I'm going to say, the idea of a distinction between what is natural and what is artificial, blurred, uncertain in all sorts of ways, and I'll come back to that at the end. The idea that machines, inanimate machines, objects created by human intellect, artifices, might be invested with some kind of life, although what life means is probably up for grabs. This is a period when clockwork devices first began to be widely available. In fact, clocks themselves began to be widely available, and the transformation that involved for people who, lived their lives according to the regulation of the seasons and the rising and setting of the sun, and when they felt hungry. And suddenly there's this new idea of clock time, an artificial division of time. So the impact of clockwork devices of different kinds. And this is a time when you've got the philosophers, Descartes, Hobbes, suggesting perhaps that human beings themselves worked according to clockwork or mechanical principles in some ways. The book looks at the impact of technology on women, particularly female labour, and also the rise or the impact or the beginnings of a modern technology with which we're all completely familiar, calculators. So the 17th century, the mid-17th, late 17th century is the point when calculating devices first began to be deployed, ways of computing without using human intellect. And at first these things are toys rather than useful devices. And these raise a kind of problem to do with the concept of free will, i.e. when you start thinking about these devices, these mechanical devices, as things that can be, as it were, programmed, then do humans actually possess what we like to think of as free will? Because I'm a professor of literature, the book is full of kind of literary stuff, but the ending on, or that last point, free will, brings in a poet that I'm constantly entranced by and teach a lot, John Milton, Paradise Lost, and his sense of an idea of free will. So in writing the book, there were two people, or two characters, I should say, who were rather important to me. The character on the left is my, alas, deceased cat, Pip. He accompanied my wife and I from Glasgow in Scotland when we moved to St. Louis in 2009. He has a lovely successor, Dublin, but that's Pip. And the character on the right was, or was, a figure who was very important to my thinking about these problems, the French 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne. Montaigne loved machines. He loved looking at machines. He writes beautifully about them. He's left us a journal of his travels through Europe in the 16th century. And whenever he saw a particularly good machine, he kind of talked about it in some way. The machines that he was particularly interested were water mills of all sorts, all kinds, which was one of the chief power devices of early modern Europe. So what does Montaigne have to say about this problem? Here's a quotation which I love. Quand je me joue à ma chatte, qui sait si elle passe son temps de moi plus que je ne fais d'elle? And the translation, when I'm playing with my cat, who knows whether she have more sport in dallying with me than I have in gaming with her? Now, anybody who owns a cat or is blessed with the company of a cat will have thought about this. Do we play with the cat, or does the cat play with us? So there's a kind of idea about agency. Are we in control? Is the cat in control? And all cat owners know immediately the answer to that. It's the cat that runs everything. So Montaigne poses this kind of problem about machinery as well, agency, the extent to which we feel free. And I want to give you a little bit of, if you like, potted history about one form of technology with which we're all familiar, computers. On the left, the brilliant Alan Turing. Have people ever come across Alan Turing? Yeah, good. Turing, if one person could be said to have won the Second World War, it was probably Alan Turing and the group of brilliant scientists that he, not just scientists, mathematicians, classical scholars, people who were interested in crossword puzzles. He brought them all together in a place called Bletchley Park in Oxfordshire, and they devoted their time to trying to crack the infamous German Enigma code. This was the code that was used by German forces to communicate throughout the Second World War. And he did it, he and his colleagues did it, using the beginnings of a computer. And the reconstruction of this device is there at the top. The British, what was called the bomb. a primitive form of analog computer, which they used to be able to crack this device, which the Germans believed was completely uncrackable, which was supposed to be absolutely immune to any form of code breaking. And that's why, I mean, the whole story actually only came out really in the 1970s, because in Britain it was still considered to be top secret long after the war had ended. Turing's life ended tragically. I won't go into it, but I will just mention that it was an unhappy ending. He's responsible for the famous Turing test. He, writing in the 1950s, so remember this is before mainframe computers, certainly before kind of computer we've got here, but he saw that the tendency with computers was that they were already beginning to blur or problematize in some way distinctions between human beings and machines. So the Turing test was a purely hypothetical exercise that Turing developed to try and work out whether or not computers, perhaps in the future, might have some degree of intelligence, although that's a sort of problematic word, thinking about how machines actually operate, computers actually operate. But he devised this famous test, the Turing test, and you can see it schematically in this diagram. So C is a human being, as is B and as is A. A and B can't see C, C can't see A and B. C poses a series of questions to A and B. A, the computer, replies. B, the human being, replies. And Turing's contention was that if C can't tell the difference between the reply he's got from A and B, if he can't tell which is the human replying and which is the computer replying, or the machine, the device replying, then to all intents and purposes, the computer has achieved some form of intelligence. So it's a way not of investigating the innate capacities of the machine so much as the operator's response to that machine. And we're kind of familiar with this through these devices. So these are captures. I'm sure you've all seen them. They don't use them so much now, and there's kind of an interesting reason for that. Now they tend to put up those tiles where, you know, have to say if there's a bus in it, or you have to say if there's a bike. I'm always failing them. Traffic lights. Oh God, right, yes. What they're exploiting with these devices are one of the kind of problems in computer science, or in kind of the operation of computers, which is that computers aren't very good at what's called OCR technology, optical character recognition technology. So humans are good because we sort of fill in the blanks. We're able to interpret these smears as words. So this is a kind of form of the Turing test. I'm actually working on a project with some graduate students at the moment where we're trying to look at how we can get computers to read vast amounts of data, not as words but actually as images, and it's proving to be extremely difficult. So the Turing test and capture. There's going to be Shakespeare. I'm sorry, there it is. There's going to be some Shakespeare. Might Shakespeare help us to know what or who is human? Now, in preparation for this series, that extraordinary engraving. This engraving, which is from the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, this engraving is the closest we think we've got to an actual likeness of William Shakespeare, although it was published after his death in 1616. It's a very strange image when you look at it, with this sort of gigantic kind of egocephalic head. I mean, if you'd met that person on the street, you'd think, gosh, they look a bit weird. So with my students, I'm currently teaching a class in Shakespeare's plays and working with my students through his plays. And we just got to the point where we were reading and studying and watching that most problematic of plays, The Merchant of Venice. The Merchant of Venice is a play, if you know it, it's a play which is really troubling in all sorts of ways. I mean, it conceals, or not so much conceals, it kind of displays levels of anti-Semitism, which make it very difficult to read now. But it also contains a great speech which Shakespeare gives to Shylock, the kind of anti-hero of the play, the Jew, as he's referred to all the way through, in which he says, what is it that makes me human? Well, I'm just the same as you. He's arguing with the Christians. He says, doth not a Jew bleed? Hath not a Jew eyes? We're bonded by some sort of common humanity. And in discussing this with my students, and knowing that I was going to come and talk with you guys today, I decided to set them a little Turing test. They didn't know this was coming, but this was in preparation for this morning's talk. And what this test consisted of, you've got in front of you on the handout. I used Shakespeare's sonnets, because we hadn't been studying the sonnets, we'd been looking at Shakespeare's plays. But I used the sonnets, and I used one sonnet in particular. And what I did was, very simply, ask ChatGPT to write a sonnet. So I asked it to write a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare on the theme of absence. So on the handout, you've got one sonnet which is by Shakespeare, and you've got one sonnet which is by ChatGPT. How many of you have used ChatGPT or an AI tools? All right, quite a few of you. Okay. So I won't go into, we might end up talking about this, but I won't go into how my kind of rather limited understanding of how these things work, these so-called large language model tools. But when I asked ChatGPT to write this sonnet, I was just amazed. I mean, it took about 3 seconds to knock out a sonnet. Okay, so here's the quiz. Which sonnet do you think is by William Shakespeare, the world's arguably greatest dramatist and poet? And which sonnet is by ChatGPT? Hands up those who think sonnet 1 is by Shakespeare. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of you think that sonnet 1 is by Shakespeare. So the rest of you are saying sonnet 2? Or yeah, how many are saying just don't know? Hands up those who just don't want to play. 1, 2, 3. My sympathies are with you. Why should you? Why should you? You haven't come here to be quizzed. So I put this to my students, and I didn't give them. I told them that one was written by a machine and one was written by a human, by Shakespeare. I purposely chose a sonnet from Shakespeare. Wrote 154 sonnets, published in 1609. Probably written in the 1590s, and he probably never intended them to be published. I mean, they're very, very, if you know them, they're incredibly personal, and I think he was probably writing for a particular individual or maybe sets of individuals. So the idea that this book was actually published, I don't think he was that happy about it. But anyway, they were published. We don't know, he may have written more, and the other thing that we don't know is whether the text of the sonnets that we've got is really what he wrote. Because there are no manuscripts, there are no authorial manuscripts that can say, right, this is definitely what William Shakespeare wrote. Anyway, I put this to my students, and this was the result. So there were 14 students who took the test. They didn't know this was coming. 10 correctly identified the Shakespeare sonnet, so 4 thought that the sonnet written by ChatGPT was by Shakespeare, so they were wrong. In other words, 71% of the students correctly identified the human being.
I wanted to amend mine. I actually started. I was glancing.
It's all right. I'm not going to use the results. Go on. You're going to amend it. Go on.
But the reason I'm changing is when I started reading the first one, it felt human.
It felt
human.
Ah, right.
It was actually expressing a feeling.
Right.
And when I actually was reading the lines,
Yeah.
it read like something you would say to someone.
When thou art gone, the world doth dim its flame.
Yes.
Yeah. So you feel that that's human.
Yes.
Yeah. You're wrong. But you're wrong in interesting ways. So here are the sort of results of. I didn't want the students to tell me, put down on a piece of paper who they were. I didn't want to. I wanted to keep it anonymous. But I did ask them just to put what their majors were. So the majors who got it correct, 3 of them were psychology students, 4 of them were English students. 1 was in med lab sciences, 1 was chemistry, and 1 was in computer sciences. And the incorrect students, 2 of them are English, 1 art history and 1 history. And this surprised me a little bit because the 2 English students who didn't get it, I reckoned to be 2 of the brightest students in the class, 2 of the most kind of perceptive students, but they didn't get it.
So you didn't ask how many of them were like big readers of Shakespeare or anything like that?
No, I knew because I've been working with them now for about 15 weeks. I've got a pretty good idea about how much Shakespeare they've read. I mean, the class as a whole. Shakespeare wrote 36 plays, and between all 20 students in the class, only 14 turned up that day. I don't know what was going on, but between the whole class, I think they've read about half the plays. But no, it's a good question because they're not kind of highly proficient readers of Shakespeare, but they've got an acquaintance with Shakespeare. But the other thing is that we haven't been studying the sonnets, so this was kind of new to them. What I thought was going to be a little sort of quick test, just a sort of almost fun thing, actually turned into a fascinating discussion with the students, and they talked to me about their kind of responses, not just to ChatGPT and other kind of AI tools, all of them of which they'd used. Most recently, the Chinese AI program that's been released, DeepSeek or Deep Search, remember. But what their feelings were about this stuff. So what tools did they use? And this emerged in the discussion. What tools did they use? And these are maybe the tools that you used in trying to kind of isolate what was written by a machine and what was written by a human. And the big one was, and it's just what this gentleman has just said, gut feeling. Well, it just felt human. One of them said, a couple of them said that one sonnet seemed to be more difficult. So that meant it must be by Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is difficult. It's kind of logical, it seems to me. They looked at, and I was very pleased to see this, they looked at the kind of technical properties of the sonnet. Sonnet is a very tightly restricted form. You have to follow certain rules if it's to genuinely count as a sonnet. So 14 lines, usually split into 3 groups with a kind of coda at the end, a 2-line rhyming couplet at the end. And the rhyme scheme is very kind of strictly delineated, A, B, C, D. So the way in which Shakespeare uses the kind of rhyme words is absolutely rigidly adhered to. And its metrical properties, written in iambic pentameters, when at war with fortune and men's lives. Kind of this beat going on. And if you look at the 2 sonnets, they absolutely conform, both of them. In fact, the ChatGPT sonnet, which as you probably realise now is the artificial sonnet, which is the one that begins, when thou art gone, the world doth dim its flame, is, if anything, it's metrically more regular than the Shakespeare sonnet. So actually using those technical kind of ways of analysing it didn't really help them very much. The big giveaway, and this I hadn't realised, but the students sort of taught me this because they were much more familiar with AI tools than I am. I mean, I tend to see them as the devil's, being a professor of English, I tend to see them as the devil's spawn. You know, I tell my students, you are not allowed to use these things in writing papers for me. Of course, I can't tell if they have or they haven't. I'd like to think I can, but I don't think I can. I know that I'm probably going to make a mistake. But the big giveaway for the students was the use of the M dash in the first sonnet. Apparently, and I didn't know this, but apparently ChatGPT always uses M dashes. So they were using punctuation, too many commas they felt in the first sonnet, and then the use of exclamation points in the second sonnet. So they were using these kind of what bibliographers, what people in my trade call accidentals, as kind of telltales. And they were looking for certain words as well. some of them felt that the fact that in the first sonnet the word time is capitalized was somehow a giveaway. They drew attention to the rhyme, the closing couplets rhyme, the meat and sweet of the first sonnet, and the cheer and near, and that they felt that this might give us a clue. And then they were using guesswork, undoubtedly. What was interesting to me as a teacher of Shakespeare was that none of them homed in on what I would call the quality issue, like which was better, and none of them really tried to look at it in terms of content or message. Rather, they were kind of responding, and I thought this takes us back to the Turing test, they were kind of responding to the sonnet as though they were machines, the students were machines trying to decode, to break the code, if you like, by looking not at the sort of overall message of the poems, whether or not it rang true in some way, but whether there were artificial elements within the poems that gave away the human and the machine. So I didn't do a kind of complete, I think there were 11 of you that said the first sonnet was by Shakespeare, 40, so you're about on par with what my students were doing. If you'd presented me with this problem without me knowing, I'd like to think, having been reading Shakespeare for 40 years, I'd like to think I'd get it right, but I'm not sure that I would, because I know that in looking at these things, there's confirmation bias in operation here, the fact that I kind of know already which one's by a machine. What was really interesting to me, let's just put up so there's the actual sonnet written by Shakespeare. Actually, when you look at that, that's how it was published in 1609, and when you look at that, you realise, oh yeah, using things like punctuation and so on is going to be a bit dodgy, because when the sonnets were first published, the punctuation was completely different to the way in which we tend to punctuate them today. Similarly, things like use of capitals, very, very different, and orthography, spelling, obviously, is very different. But what was interesting to me in this sort of discussion was the way in which what it disclosed about the students' own attitudes towards technology. And I would say that, and particularly the technology of artificial intelligence, and I'd say that the one word that came to my mind as I listened to them was troubling, that they felt troubled by it. They, much more than me, 100% more than me, are growing up with this technology, and they're keenly aware, these are 20-year-olds, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, they're keenly aware of the sense that they're in competition with this technology in various ways. One student said that she'd recently had a consultation with a careers guidance officer, a careers guidance counsellor at SLU, and one of the things that she was told was that, look, when you put together your CV, your curriculum vitae, and you're applying for jobs, you've got to write it so that it can be read by AI, because AI is making the first cut. 150 applications for one position, they're using AI. The students talked about, because they were much more familiar with the technology than I am, they told me things I didn't know. One student claimed, and I don't know if this is true, that although AI is good at certain things, at other things it's really, really poor. Apparently, and I haven't checked this out, if you ask, I'm sure they've rectified this if this is the case, but if you ask something like ChatGPT how many R's, letter R's, there are in the word strawberries, it can't do it. It gets it wrong. I don't know, is that true? It may be. We'll have to try it out. I'm sure they'll have fixed that. But they talked as well about how for certain disciplines, certain subjects, it was really, really poor. Its tendency to hallucinate, to give out false information. Because how it's working, of course, and this is a little bit where we get into the black box, it's using what's called a large language model to generate words. It doesn't understand in the way that human beings, like you have just demonstrated your understanding, it doesn't understand what it's writing. It doesn't think in the way that human beings are doing. It's predicting through investing words with tokens. So it takes a word, it's taken the word absence, and then it's calculated all the likely words that might come after that. And it does that through having scraped millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of words of text down cold, mainly from the internet. And actually that raises an ethical problem. It raises several ethical problems. I looked up to try and find out how much of my own writings had been scraped in forming these large language models, and I was appalled to learn that at least 20 articles and 3 books of mine had been used as part of the training process for these things. Now, I never gave permission, and I didn't receive any royalties. This is all copyright material. Somebody is making a huge amount of money off the work that I've done, so there's one kind of, if you like, ethical problem. Another ethical problem, I think, is that, and this was one I committed in doing this exercise, these AI devices are ferocious consumers of resources, water, power, electricity, and human beings. So one of the ways in which they have tried to kind of purge these models of coming back with offensive or inappropriate or racist responses is they've used usually highly underpaid labourers in third world, what we used to call third world countries, to go through these kinds of responses, training them, if you like. And that labour has been described as a form of torture for the people that are doing it. The chemist, really clever student, Rosie, she said, yeah, I've tried using AI in chemistry and writing chemical equations, and it just can't do it. It won't do it. The students are in a dilemma, though, because half my colleagues in the university are using AI, professors are using AI. I was shocked when one of the students in this discussion told me that her professor was using AI to write prompts for student exercises. I just shook my head in despair at that point. But, you know, I mean, a good number of colleagues on the maths and stats side are working on this machine, on these devices, and I admire them for doing it. You know, they're they're trying to kind of make these things operate, you know, more efficiently. And then there's sort of, you know, like, there's the humanists, there's the you know, as ever, the wretched professors of English who are getting all huffy about it, because of course we can see our jobs going in the end. And that brings us back to another aspect of technology and our intersection with technology. So I think this exercise, I'm going to stop in a minute, I think this exercise is kind of intriguing for me because it illustrates what Alan Turing back in the 1950s was kind of worrying at, the speed with which technology is moving into areas which we think of as being inhabited primarily by human beings. The fact that it can write a perfectly passable Shakespeare sonnet, and we could sit down and talk about this sonnet in more detail and do a bit of literary analysis on it. But the fact that it can do it is already, to me, amazing. I'm going to leave you with 3 quotations. So the first one is from the Sage of Vienna, Sigmund Freud. Freud wrote a lot about he didn't just do, you know, psychoanalysis. He didn't just say that, you know, everything is all about sex. He also wrote a great deal, very perceptively, about literature and art. And he also wrote what I think of as one of his most important books, Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a book which worries at the fact, it's written in the 1930s, and it comes out of his experiences of the First World War. But it's a book that worries at modernity, and why, for all the kind of technological prowess that we possess or are in possession of in the modern world, we don't feel happy in it, which is kind of what my students were saying about their responses to technology. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. And I've put on the back of the handout, you've got the whole quotation in context, and it's worth looking at the rest of it. But man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he's truly magnificent. But those organs are not grown onto him, and they give him, sorry, I put in a wrong thing there, and they give him much trouble at times. Future ages will bring with them new and probably unimaginably great advances in this field of civilization, and will increase man's likeness to God still more. But in the interests of our investigations, we will not forget that present-day man does not feel happy in his godlike character. So technology doesn't necessarily, or doesn't seem to induce necessarily happiness. He uses the word prosthetic, which I think is important. That takes us back to the idea of a restitution or a restoration, a way of compensating in some way. Looking around at you, I see that a number of you, like me, are using prostheses. I'm short-sighted, so I wear my specs. I also have hearing aids. I had a terrible bout with COVID back in the UK, and I lost a lot of my hearing and didn't know what was going on until I went and got it checked out, and they gave me these hearing aids, which are absolutely brilliant. Transformed life for me. I hadn't realized how deaf I was. So, in other words, prosthesis, really important, really helpful. I think he's talking in that quotation, he's remembering when he talks about putting on these auxiliary organs. I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about technology as being something, that you can put on in the way that I put on my hearing aids each morning. But I think he's thinking as well of the myth of Icarus and Daedalus. Icarus, who flies too close to the sun, creates, his father Daedalus creates for him artificial wings to escape the island of Crete. It's a Greek myth told by Ovid. Creates these wings to escape Crete. His father warns him, says, don't fly too close to the sun because you'll burn the wings. And he does. He loves these wings. He loves flying. He flies too high and he tumbles to his destruction. And that's another, if you like, myth of, a founding myth of technology and our responses to technology. Second quotation, and I'm dreading you're going to ask me questions about this one, like what does it mean, by, I think, probably the most impenetrable philosopher of technology that I've tried to grapple with, Martin Heidegger, who is himself, if you know anything about modern European history, who is himself a deeply problematic person, ethically challenging in all sorts of ways. Heidegger, although an extraordinarily talented philosopher, was also deeply implicated in the Third Reich and in Nazi rule. But in this 1954 essay, he posed the problem of technology. He says the essence of technology is by no means anything technological. Thus, we shall never experience our relationship to the essence of technology so long as we merely represent and pursue the technological, put up with it, or evade it. Everywhere we remain unfree and chained to technology, whether we passionately affirm or deny it. But we are delivered over to it in the worst possible way when we regard it as something neutral, for this conception of it, to which today we particularly like to pay homage, makes us utterly blind to the essence of technology. And you're probably going to ask me, so what is the essence of technology, according to Heidegger? And I can answer to you, I still don't really understand him. He says at one point in this essay, he says that the point about technology is, and he's full of these kind of aphorisms, he says it's something poetic. He uses the Greek word poiein, meaning poetry, and he's riffing off the idea that a poem is itself a piece of technology. You can think of a poem as a machine that's been described as a machine to think with. So his important point, though, I think, is that it's not neutral. We like to think of it as neutral, but it's not neutral, which doesn't mean that it's necessarily invested with malicious design, but to treat it as neutral is then to sidestep its effect on us. And the third and final quotation is from Donna Haraway. Donna Haraway is a historian of science and technology. She began her career as a biologist. She did a Ph.D. at Yale, I think it was Yale, in biology. But she tried to combine, or has tried to combine, feminist thinking with the history of science and technology. And she comes up with this remarkable observation, and this written in the 1990s. So, cell phones are there, but that's about it. Computers are there. But she's kind of thinking through our relationship between computers and humans, our devices and humans. Late 20th century machines have made thoroughly ambiguous the difference between natural and artificial, mind and body, and many other distinctions that used to apply to organisms and machines. Our machines are disturbingly lively, and we ourselves frighteningly inert. And I think, you know, whenever you, it's really strikes me when I start my classes that students sit there and they don't talk to one another. They're all on their phones. Saddest thing in the world is watching a couple in a restaurant. And they're just looking at their phones. Ah, we'll have to cheer up. Discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. You can be amongst yourselves.
Oh, okay. Well, you made a comment about professors worrying that AI was going to take their spot. And
Oh, it is.
yeah, no, I don't disagree. But what it made me think is that all of this AI is based on the work of humans.
Yeah.
And then you're going to replace the humans, and there will be nothing for the AI. It feels like it's going to be a loop that kind of collapses. There will be nowhere for it to go because you've replaced the humans that you've developed what they're basing the AI on.
Thoughts?
Well, I frequently wonder how does it correct itself? And it doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't. So, you know, yes, it's getting better. I mean, chat.
GPT, yeah.
Their image maker, right? The new release it's ridiculously realistic. Like, you cannot tell the difference. And I have a pretty keen eye, right? And you cannot tell the difference.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what is the correction? And sometimes I wonder, like, okay, so all of this getting rid of, you know, DEI within the National Archive, is it strictly because of they want that information absent?
It's because it can be done.
Yeah.
It's partly because it's done. To respond to your thing, I mean, my colleagues who are working in this field told me that what these, not just ChatGPT, but what these kind of AI systems, and maybe we shouldn't use the word artificial intelligence, maybe there's a problem with that word, but they themselves are not fully aware of how these things are working.
Yeah, they're simulators. It's not really intelligence. It's simulating what people do.
I don't think it's intelligence in the way that we would like to think about intelligence, but whether it's simulation, I'm not sure about that either, but certainly they're capable of producing results of which the human, if you like, creators, this is a Frankenstein story in a way, but the human creators are themselves bamboozled as to how it's got there, which would suggest that they're already operating at a level which is evading human beings. When your question's a very good one, when it's kind of just turning on itself, what does it do with humans?
Right.
We become energy sources, presumably we'll work for them.
Right.
Welcome to our overlords.
Yeah, and what is the point of educating humans to do what a computer will do, and then there will be no humans who are, and when the whole thing collapses, humans, it's almost like they're engineering a civilization collapse.
Humans have a great propensity for kind of inventing forms of technology which are used to do one task, but they end up doing a completely different task which was never part of the kind of decided outcome. And the classic example is the cell phone. If you had asked me, 30 years ago, how would it be possible to persuade 300 million Americans to carry around with them every day a tracking device, I'd have said, you can't do it. America is the land of the free. It will never happen. And every one of us in here, I think, is probably carrying a tracking device.
Orwell couldn't have thought
of
a better surveillance system.
Yeah. And of course, thinking about it, they're play machines as well. This comes back to technology as play. Those early mechanical calculators that people like Pascal and Leibniz were working on, they were trying to address a sort of mathematical problem, but they were trying to address as well a philosophical problem. Can we get a machine to add up? Answer is yes, we can. Oh, that's great fun. Let's have another drink. But what they weren't thinking of was necessarily something useful. So we tend to think of technological models as being, problem, solution, usefulness.
Yeah.
But often technological breakthroughs come through play as much as through applying. But what we can't predict ever, I think this is what Heidegger is trying to say, is what we can't predict is the outcome, the uses that we then put it to, and now I think the uses that it puts us to. You were going to say?
Yeah, I'm in IT in a
Ah!
giant company.
I want to say I'm not anti-technology.
No, I'm not a fan of this at all.
Uh-huh.
I have major ethical problems that I have been moaning about this for a couple of years because I support the arts. I go to a lot of art festivals, and I am so mad on behalf of artists about this. Like you said about your copyrighted work.
Yeah, it's just being stolen.
It's so horrible to me.
Yeah.
And actually, you didn't even go into it very much. Even though you mentioned that you've been impacted, but you really didn't even delve it. And a couple months ago, I got free tickets through a friend of a friend to the last few St. Louis Speaker Series, and Oren at Sawday was the speaker. Who does he has an AI institute and founded TrueMedia.org to try to help show fake news and.
Yeah.
And he was very interesting to listen to, but he even just like barely skipped over the ethics of it as well. And he just kind of raved about how much it's going to help medicine and this and that, and we should be using it every day to teach it. And
What do you see? It's really interesting. So you're working in AI. What do you see as
I
the
don't
real?
work in IT. I work in IT.
Oh, sorry, IT. But what do you? Well, you have 3 million times the technological prowess that I do. But what do you see as the ethical?
Well,
issue?
like you said,
Yeah.
it's just finding sources of material, like your books or
Yeah.
articles, and instead of like a normal search engine just showing like if you have an author website or whatever, instead of providing that result, it's mangling you and other works maybe, and perhaps changing the meaning.
Well, it's
Like,
recast.
are people going to realize the meaning's been changed? Maybe?
It's recasting and it's appropriating.
And so that from the unethical side of wrong as
Yeah.
well as the factual wrongness,
Yeah.
both disturb me.
Yeah.
And it's not
No, yeah. I can sense I'm being kicked off the stage. There's
I was just gonna say,
One more.
we were talking about strawberry and jet. It still thinks it has 2 waters.
Oh, really? Does it? You just checked? QED.
See, it's wrong.
It's wrong.
It's so wrong.
But how is that? That's so.
There was another one where they tried to get ChatGPT to design the plans for a rocket, like build a rocket, right?
Elon Musk, that should be listening. Yeah.
But it was a fail. It was a fail. Like the designs had massive flaws in them that were even mathematical. Like it couldn't
But
do the.
I know that Bill wants to get rid of me. But what listening to us, it's almost as though we're kind of survivors in the bunker. So the enemy is not that bad, but it is the enemy. That's how we.
One more thought. I think that I'm in marketing, and so we talk about this a lot. It's totally going to take my job. Bob's a musician, totally going to take his job. But
Never.
what I think we're going to see, and I think we're already seeing it, is your students, like the younger people, are starting to seek out one-on-one communication because they know in their core you cannot trust anything.
There is a sort of turn away.
Yeah.
There is a kind of turn away,
which is good news.
well, could be good news. I don't know.
Let's go one more with Kim, and then we'll break up.
I work at the same large company that Sarah works at, and they actually brought in a ChatGPT version that's behind a firewall that is more protected. And like I'm in communications, and we were basically told you have to learn how to use this, or you're going to be replaced. And I've used it, and it comes back with these trite, awful, cliche headlines.
I mean, I think that's the thing about that first sonnet is actually really trite when you look at it. But that's me as a Shakespeare professor talking. But sorry, go on. Yeah, trite.
And so, but like, on the event, I've been able to like pick out pieces, like, oh, I like that word, and
Yeah.
come up with my own. I was an editor for a couple of years. Like, I could tell when somebody must have missed something that was written, but we've basically told them we have to learn to play nice with this thing, or
Yeah.
be replaced. And like, it's only as good as the, I guess, prompts you put in.
Yeah. I mean, Marx in the 1850s, Karl Marx in the 1850s was right, saying exactly that it was the replacement. The worker becomes ancillary to the machine, becomes an organ of the machine, and we're still living through that. I mean, that's I'm not going to preach the gospel according to St. Mark's, but he was right about that. I think.
He said no.
Just let it go. Just let it go. Just go.
Well, my question is
Sorry.
during that process, is the AI learning
To get to
from you?
lunch, but I'll have a quick chat.
Yes,
Say it again. Sorry.
During that process of her editing
Yeah.
the AI, is the AI learning from her?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Every time you use it, it's learning. Although apparently not in the case of strawberries. I'll stop there, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you.